She was pulled over, insulted, and threatened at gunpoint, all because of the color of her skin. What the cop didn't know? She was a high-ranking army officer. What happened next will leave you stunned. This shocking incident highlights the dangers of prejudice and power abuse. A black female driver, calm and composed, faced a racist officer who assumed she was powerless. With a gun aimed at her and insults thrown her way, it seemed like she had no chance. But in court, the truth about her identity came out, turning the tables entirely. This isn't just a story of humiliation. It's a story of justice, accountability, and the downfall of a man who misused his badge. You won't believe how this unfolded. It started as an ordinary day for a black female driver on a quiet road. But what should have been a routine drive quickly turned into a nightmare. Out of nowhere, flashing police lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She pulled over, staying calm and composed as anyone would when dealing with law enforcement. But instead of a professional interaction, she was met with hostility. The officer, a middle-aged white man in uniform, approached her vehicle with aggression. Before she could even say a word, he pulled out his gun, pointing it directly at her. "Step out of the car," he shouted, his tone dripping with prejudice. The driver complied, her hands visible and movements slow, showing no signs of resistance. Yet, the officer's behavior only escalated. He hurled insults at her, making demeaning comments about her race and gender. "Figures, people like you always think you're above the law," he sneered. The driver, still calm, tried to explain herself, but the officer cut her off, his words laced with venom. It was clear that he had already judged her based solely on her appearance. The situation grew more intense as the officer continued his verbal assault, ignoring her attempts to clarify the situation. Other cars passed by, some slowing down to witness the spectacle, but no one intervened. For the driver, the humiliation was unbearable. She knew she had done nothing wrong, yet here she was treated as a criminal simply because of the biases of a man with a badge. But there was more to this story than met the eye. The driver wasn't just any ordinary citizen. She was a respected female officer in the military, someone who had dedicated her life to serving her country. Her calm demeanor wasn't out of fear, but from years of training and discipline. She knew that any sudden move or word could escalate the situation further. The officer, unaware of her background, continued his tirade, threatening to arrest her without cause. He accused her of resisting, even though she had complied with every order. His abuse of power was blatant, and his words revealed the deep-rooted racism that fueled his actions. For the driver, the challenge wasn't just surviving this encounter. It was about preserving her dignity and staying alive in a situation that could have easily turned deadly. She faced the impossible task of standing her ground without provoking further aggression. Her silence spoke volumes, but the officer only saw it as defiance. The challenges didn't end there. The event was captured on a passerby's phone, the video showing the stark contrast between the officer's hostility and the driver's composure. As the video spread, public outrage began to grow. Questions arose. How often does this happen? How many voices go unheard? The incident wasn't just a personal ordeal for the driver. It became a symbol of the larger problem of racism and abuse of power within law enforcement. For the woman, it wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about challenging a system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Her journey to justice was far from over. While the immediate ordeal ended with the officer letting her go after issuing baseless threats, the real battle began in court. The challenges she faced during the encounter were just the tip of the iceberg. Exposing the truth and holding the officer accountable would prove to be an uphill climb, but she was determined to see it through. This story is not just about one woman or one officer. It's about a system that allows prejudice to thrive. It's a reminder of the challenges many face when standing up against injustice and the courage it takes to fight back. As the dust settled from the initial confrontation on the road, the woman knew that this wasn't over. What had happened was just the beginning. While the officer may have let her go, his actions couldn't be ignored. And even though the immediate threat of violence had subsided, the mental and emotional toll it took on her was far from finished. But she was more than capable of handling it. It wasn't just about her. The racism she experienced that day was part of a much bigger, more deeply rooted issue. It wasn't just one bad cop or one bad situation. It was systemic, an ongoing issue that had plagued many communities for years. And now, the world was about to witness it all unfold in the court of law. The first step in her journey was taking the video that had surfaced online seriously. The footage of the incident quickly went viral, sparking public outrage. People from all walks of life saw the cruel treatment she had endured at the hands of a man who was supposed to protect her. They saw the power imbalance, the deep prejudices embedded within law enforcement, and the undeniable evidence that racism was at the core of this incident. It wasn't just her word against his. It was right there for the world to see. For her, seeing the video spread like wildfire was a mixture of emotions. Part of her was grateful. She knew that the attention would bring light to what happened. It wasn't just about her individual experience anymore. It was about addressing the larger problem of racial discrimination and abuse of power. But at the same time, she felt a certain vulnerability. Her privacy had been violated, her personal trauma exposed for the world to watch. But she was no stranger to adversity. She had faced challenges head-on before, and she wasn't going to stop now. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted. The officer's actions sparked protests and calls for justice. People began to demand accountability, not just for this particular officer, but for the entire system that allowed such abuse to occur. But as the public outcry grew, so did the resistance. Many tried to discredit her, questioning her version of events. Some went so far as to claim that she had provoked the officer, trying to shift the blame from his actions to hers. This, unfortunately, wasn't new. It was a narrative that had been used time and time again, blaming the victims of racial abuse instead of addressing the real issue. the unchecked power and biases that permeated law enforcement. But she wasn't going to let anyone take away her voice. She was used to fighting for justice in her role as an army officer, and now she was using those same skills in a different arena. Her calm composure in the face of aggression, her ability to stay focused despite the chaos, became crucial in the development of her case. She knew that the road to justice would be long and complicated, but she was ready for the fight. As her legal team prepared for the upcoming trial, the discovery phase began. Evidence was gathered, and it became clear that this wasn't just a case of one rogue cop behaving badly. This was part of a much larger issue. There were countless complaints against the officer for similar behavior, unjustified stops, threats, and abuse aimed at people of color. But for some reason, these complaints had been ignored or brushed aside. His behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern of conduct that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The investigation revealed more than just the officer's past actions. It uncovered a culture of complacency within the department, where officers who engaged in discriminatory behavior were protected, not held accountable. It became clear that the department had failed to act on numerous warnings and complaints, and that this was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed, not just for the woman's sake, but for the safety and well-being of the entire community. Meanwhile, the woman's personal life was impacted in ways she hadn't expected. Her story had become national news, and while some supported her, others subjected her to criticism and even threats. Yet, she remained resilient. Her service in the Army had taught her to face adversity without letting it define her. And now, she used those lessons to stay focused on her mission, justice. The emotional and mental toll wasn't easy. The stress of preparing for a court case while dealing with public backlash and personal challenges took its toll on her. But through it all, her sense of duty remained steadfast. She knew that if she could stand strong and hold on to the truth, it would lead to a moment of reckoning for the officer and the system as a whole. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been subjected to the same kind of treatment, for every person who had been ignored or dismissed simply because of their race or background. As the court date approached, the stakes were high. The trial was more than just a chance to hold the officer accountable. It was an opportunity to show the world how deeply racism had infiltrated law enforcement and how crucial it was for that system to be reformed. The development of the case wasn't just about the woman's courage. It was about shining a light on an issue that had been swept under the rug for far too long. The stage was set, and all eyes were on the courtroom. The moment of truth was coming, and it would reveal not only the officer's guilt, but also the larger flaws within the system he represented. The trial had reached its pivotal moment. For weeks, both sides had presented their arguments, each trying to sway the jury in their favor. The courtroom was filled with tension, with everyone aware that this case wasn't just about one officer's wrongdoing. It was about something much bigger. It was about justice, accountability, and the systemic issues that had allowed abuse of power to go unchecked for far too long. The woman, once just a victim of a racially motivated encounter, had become the voice for countless others who had experienced the same injustice. The turning point came when the woman took the stand. With a calm but determined voice, she recounted every detail of the incident, from the moment the officer pulled her over to the insults and threats he had thrown her way. Her words were powerful, but it wasn't just her testimony that made the difference. It was her unwavering composure. The jury could see the strength in her, the courage to face down a man who had tried to break her, and the dignity she carried despite the humiliation she had suffered. But the true shock came when the defense tried to discredit her by questioning her credibility. They tried to paint her as someone who had exaggerated the events, someone who was simply trying to make a case out of nothing. They claimed she had provoked the officer in some way, that her behavior had somehow warranted the aggression. But their attempts to undermine her failed. The evidence was undeniable. The turning point came when the prosecution brought forward the key piece of evidence, the officer's previous history. It wasn't just one isolated incident. The officer had been involved in numerous complaints, all alleging racial profiling, verbal abuse, and threats of violence. The defense had tried to dismiss this, claiming it was irrelevant to the case at hand. But the prosecution argued otherwise. This pattern of behavior wasn't just a coincidence. It was a clear indication of the officer's racist attitudes and his history of abuse. And then the video footage was played in the courtroom. The very video that had gone viral, the one showing the officer pointing a gun at the woman and hurling insults at her, was now front and center. The courtroom fell silent as the jury watched the footage again. There was no denying what had happened. The officer's actions were there for all to see. His behavior wasn't just inappropriate, it was criminal. He had abused his position of power, and his actions had put an innocent life at risk. The video didn't lie. But the most powerful moment came when the woman's identity was fully revealed. The jury had no idea that she wasn't just a regular citizen. She wasn't just any black woman on the street. She was a highly respected army officer. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with when he pulled her over. He had assumed that because she was a black woman, she was weak, powerless, and disposable. But when the truth came out, it shattered his assumptions. The woman wasn't just a victim, she was a force to be reckoned with. The courtroom erupted in shock. The officer, who had thought he could intimidate her and get away with it, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The defense tried to recover, but the damage had already been done. The jury had seen the truth, and it was clear to them that this officer's actions were not just a one-time mistake. They were part of a larger, more disturbing pattern. And now, it was time for him to face the consequences. The judge's verdict came swiftly. Guilty, he declared, the word hanging heavy in the air. The officer's face drained of color as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. His career, his reputation, his future, everything he had built had come crashing down in an instant. The woman's reaction was calm, but there was a sense of relief in her eyes. Justice had been served, but it wasn't just about winning the case. It was about something much deeper. It was about proving that even in a world that often overlooks the struggles of marginalized people, there is still a chance for truth and justice to prevail. As the officer was escorted out of the courtroom, his future uncertain, the woman stood tall. Her courage had not only led to his downfall, but had also sent a powerful message. No one, no matter how powerful or how protected, could get away with racism and abuse of power. The system had failed to stop this officer before, but now the truth had exposed him, and he would face the consequences of his actions. This moment was a key turning point, not just for her, but for all those who had ever been mistreated and silenced. The verdict was a victory, but it was also a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. The battle may have been won, but the war against systemic racism and abuse of power was still ongoing. And with that, the woman knew that her fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a much larger movement for change. The courtroom verdict was more than just a personal victory. It was a triumph for justice and a stark reminder of the power of truth. The officer who thought he could get away with racism and abuse of power had been exposed, and in that moment, the woman's strength and courage became a symbol of hope for others who had faced similar injustice. This case wasn't just about one officer. It was about the systemic issues that allow such behavior to continue unchecked. The officer's actions were part of a larger pattern of abuse that had been overlooked for far too long. But in this case, the truth came to light, and accountability was served. The guilty verdict sent a message. No one, no matter their position or power, is above the law. For the woman, this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about making sure that the next person who faced such an ordeal would not be ignored. Her fight for justice was a reminder that standing up against injustice can change lives and inspire others to do the same. This victory wasn't just hers. It was for everyone who has ever been wronged, and it marked the beginning of a much-needed conversation about change. If stories like this inspire you, hit subscribe and check out our next video.